Welcome back to Between Bells. Last year, as the world battled a global pandemic, a racial pandemic was taking off right here at home. After the death of George Floyd, America began to have a racial awakening. Since then, shocking incidents of police brutality, the rise of white supremacy, and a Capitol insurrection have made it clear that America remains alarmingly divided. Now a new book is examining how we got here in the first place. Race Against Time, The Politics of a Darkening America is a book written by journalist, political commentator, and author Keith Boykin, who has covered many racial incidents in our country. He joins us now. Keith, welcome to the show. Such a pleasure to have you. We know racism is nothing new in our country, but for some reason it feels like there's been more attacks, not just on Black Americans, but Asians, Jewish Americans as well. What makes this moment so different?
I think what's so different about now is that we've never seen our country this divided in recent history. I mean, we have a long history, as you point out, going back to the 18th and 19th century. We actually fought a civil war over the issue of race. But since 1964, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, immediately afterwards with the race riots and that took place in the late 60s, we haven't seen this type of animosity in our country. It's been sort of tamped down. And in the past 5 years or so, we've seen a growing rise of this. A lot of this took place at the end of the Obama administration, in part because we elected a Black president. A lot of it took place in the Trump administration. We saw a dramatic surge in hate crimes during that time. And it all precipitated with where we are right now with the insurrection at the United States Capitol in January of this year. And so this is a moment for us to really take a deep look at who we are and what kind of country we want to be moving forward.
You've written books in the past about the struggles that Black Americans face, but what was the moment you decided, Keith, that you wanted to write Race Against Time?
Well, the primary impetus was actually years ago when I first started thinking about what happened after Charlottesville. But that wasn't the moment when I actually decided to write. It was later on in the administration, in the Trump administration, when I started hearing language that was reminiscent of civil war. I started hearing people, including the president, talk about the people would rebel. They'd stand up and fight if somebody tried to remove me. This was in response to the impeachment talk. And we don't have people talk like that as American leaders in our country. You hear that type of language in other countries. And then we started to see this whole sort of racial reckoning that people were calling it last year after George Floyd was killed. And that's when it became inevitable. You know, I was arrested here in New York City just a few days after George Floyd was killed while I was covering a protest, merely covering a protest on the West Side Highway. And they took me away, they arrested me, they locked me up in jail for 6 hours. And it was a reflection, I think, of just why people were protesting in the first place, this idea that the police were responding to what was a social justice crisis with heavy-handed law enforcement tactics. And in our country, historically, what we have done is when African Americans have asked for justice, we've responded with heavy-handed law enforcement tactics instead. And this is a trend that can't continue in the future.
Keith, I'm so glad you brought up that experience when you were arrested. Thank you for sharing that with us. I have to ask, I saw the video as I was researching this interview. Were you surprised at the tactics that they used, not only against you, but other journalists, Black journalists that ended up in jail that day?
I guess I was surprised. I don't know why I was, because I shouldn't have been. But my arrest took place just a day after Omar Jimenez, who was a Black CNN journalist, colleague of mine, was arrested on air while reporting from Minneapolis. And the irony in that arrest was that there was a white colleague of his who also worked for CNN, who was covering the same protest, who was not arrested. And so the racial disparity was evident there. And I think there may be a tendency among law enforcement to see African Americans who are at a protest, irrespective of whether we're working with the press or not, and assume that we must be there causing trouble just like the protesters they think are doing. And that's troubling. It's a reflection of the fact that we have to do a better job in policing in this country. We have to do a better job of letting people know the role of the press, the valuable role of the press in producing information, disseminating this information so the public knows what's going on. The public has a right to know about the insurrection in January. They have a right to know about the protests in last summer after George Floyd was killed. And they have a right to hold the police and other institutions accountable.
You mentioned Omar. I'm so glad you remember that. I remember that day vividly because he was on Cheddar News just a few hours before he got arrested. And I remember the news that day. It was just absolutely terrifying. Speaking of horrific things that Americans go through, let's talk about those photos of Border Patrol agents on horseback grabbing Haitian migrants down in Texas. There were whips involved. What's your response to those images, Keith?
The sad truth is that we still have a country where Black people are treated differently from other people. And what we see with the images of the Border Patrol agents attacking Black Haitian migrants who are simply trying to ask for asylum, those images are horrifying, and they are reminiscent of slavery. They're reminiscent of the slave patrols in our country. And it's a long history of law enforcement in the country being used essentially to police Black and brown bodies to make white people feel safe. This is not the way America is supposed to be operating. And yet here it is in 2021, even with the Democratic president and the Black Democratic vice president, we're still carrying on the same policies of the previous administration. This is a moment for our country to really sort of think about what it is we're doing here. How do we end this? We can't just say we're troubled by this. We have to actually stop these policies, start treating these Haitian immigrants just like we treat other immigrants, with dignity and respect. And we have to come back to who we say we are as a country. You know, in the Statue of Liberty, there's that plaque that says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free." Well, what kind of country are we when a group of people who are suffering from hurricanes and earthquakes and a political assassination are fleeing for their lives, fleeing for safety to the United States of America, and we throw them away, put them on planes, and we send armed white police officers, law enforcement officers on horseback with whips to attack them. That doesn't speak of who we are as an exceptional country. It speaks of who we are as a country that is still in need of much more progress.
You know, I'm so lucky at my office. I get to see the Statue of Liberty every day staring out the window, and I think those very things every time I step in. Do you think the Biden administration is handling this Haitian refugee situation correctly, Keith?
No, I think the Biden administration needs to do more to handle this Haitian crisis better. You can't be sending people back on planes as soon as they get here without sort of hearings. You can't have armed Border Patrol officers on horseback with whips who are attacking migrants simply for trying to apply for asylum in this country. And you can't blame the Trump administration anymore because the Biden administration is in charge. They have to hold people accountable. It's not enough to say, well, this is the last guy's policies and we need to wait till we change them. We have to stop that now. Joe Biden is the president of the United States. Kamala Harris is the vice president. They have a duty, a responsibility to stop this right now and not to wait for some other investigation to take place or to wait for people to talk about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is no longer the president. He may have started it, but he's not the one who's operating the Border Patrol right now.
Keith Boykin, author of Race Against Time, The Politics of a Darkening America. I will be buying this book, Keith. I'm such a fan. Thank you so much for being on the show. We really appreciate your time.